सलाम, नमस्ते, सत श्री अकाल। जुगनूनामा में आपको एक नया जाविया पेश करेंगे, उर्दू, अंग्रेजी, पंजाबी तीनों जबानों में। लाइक और सब्सक्राइब करना मत भूलिएगा। My guest today is Namit Arora, author and public historian. I first met Namit through his very engaging web series, Indians. And it's a captivating story about our 5,000-year-old Indus Valley civilization. And I was especially drawn because I live within 40 miles of Harappa in District Okara, which is where my ancestral home is. Welcome, Namit. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jugnu. Thanks for having me.
Namit, I'd like to start with your own story. 2 decades ago, you gave up a thriving career in tech in Silicon Valley, of all places, in favor of reading and writing history. Why ever did you do that?
Well, I did that. There's a little story. So I began working in Silicon Valley in the early 90s. And just about 2, 3 years into it, I realized that wasn't for me. And I found the work intellectually dull, but it paid well. And I had no other way of earning a living. So I kept doing it as a day job while cultivating a whole parallel life of reading, writing, and taking time off to backpack around the world. Uh, and I was lucky to have Stanford University nearby, where I began taking evening and weekend courses. I began writing essays, travelogues, and bad poetry as a way of working out my view of the world. Though it took me many more years of writing and publishing and rejections and so on to take myself seriously as a writer and to consider doing it full time.
Well, apart from Stanford, if I may ask, you may have also had a supportive partner in all of this in your adventures?
Yes, I think, well, the partner actually came a bit later.
Oh, okay.
The one who, yes, that one was many years after that, about a decade after. So,
Oh, by the time
initial
you'd
part
made
of
your
my
life
journey.
choices. Sorry, by the
Yes,
time
yes.
you'd made your life choices.
Some of the key life choices, yes, about my reading and writing and that sort of thing. Yes, and I actually, when I met my partner, she had very similar interests, which is what brought us together.
What could be better than that? But Namit, had you known when you made the decision in 2013 that your chosen path would entail challenges, which I'm sure it has done, would you still have made the same decision?
I think so, yes. I left Silicon Valley to become a full-time writer, and that remains my primary identity today. And history is certainly one of my deepest interests. But I write about other topics too. For me, I've found this journey immensely rewarding, and I've never regretted um, making this choice.
I do so envy you, Namit, because when I was up at university, I made the tragic decision of reading law instead of history, and I had a choice. But somehow, what do you know at 19? And by the time I was
Yeah,
committed, it was too bloody late. So anyway, but
yeah.
I've read history all my life as a layperson, of course. But when I was watching your web series, Indians, episode one was of, as I said, of particular interest to me because of my ancestral home being so close to Harappa. And amongst your other works, of course, the most recent one is Speaking of History, which you've done with the great Romila Thapar. Um, and this is a collaboration between the two of you, but I want to know how it came about.
Yeah, it actually started right around when the web series was airing. I'd reached out to Professor Thapar halfway into the web series, and to my surprise, she had already discovered it and was watching it with great interest. And in an email to me, she said nice things about it, which really delighted me. So we met soon afterwards, and Among many things, one of the things we were talking about was why is history so controversial in India today? And and we thought, it might be an interesting idea to just talk about that and see if we can write that up, transcribe that as a conversation for some Indian publication. And so we agreed, and then we got into it. And then the scope of the conversation kept growing. And I suppose we were both having fun. And before we knew, we had enough material, which we thought we could polish into a book. So we transcribed everything. And then we refined it and expanded bits of it here and there, more examples and so on. And that's how that project came about.
I completely understand how captivated you must have been with her. And I'd like to digress here for a minute and tell you my own story about her. Of course, we've known the Thapar family for ages. And of course, across the generations before the partition, some of our ancestors knew each other here in West Punjab before they migrated. And in the good old days when General Musharraf was in power in Pakistan and he was trying to make peace, and Vajpayee Saab was on the other side, then Manmohan Singh Saab was on the other side. So we would come and go. And I decided to do a series called Tum Yaad Aaye. And it's a very famous Ustad Mehdi Hasan ghazal, ke bhuli bisri chand umeeden chand fasane yaad aaye. So I was doing that for Pakistan television, and I interviewed 13 people who had migrated from India to Pakistan at the partition, and 13 people who had migrated from Pakistan to India. And amongst them was Romila Thapar. So I went to Romila ji's place and we began talking, and she spoke of a kind of idyllic childhood when she'd been peripatetic with her father. He'd been traveling, then Northwest Frontier as well.
Oh,
And she
yeah.
told me some wondrous stories about what it was like, what the nomads were like, what the Pathans were like, how much kind of richness there was to her childhood. Then, Namit, she began to tell me about the home that she had occupied as a teenager in Lahore. So I said, "Where is the home, Romila ji?" And she said, "It's on Lawrence Road, facing Lawrence Gardens." So I said, "Really?" And she said, "Try and find it if you can." So when I returned to Lahore, I took my cameraman and I went to Lawrence Gardens, and she had described it to have been kind of tucked away on a little set aside from the main road. And she told me how it was an L-shaped drive, etc. I found an L-shaped drive off the main Lawrence Road. I went in there. She described the entrance. It seemed to be roughly the same. I walked in with my cameraman, and then I took her on the phone with me. And I said,
Oh,
"Romila,
wow.
yeah," I said, "Romila ji, I'm here at a place that I think might be your home." So she said, "What do you see?" So I said, "As recommended by you, I've entered via the side entrance. There's nobody here right now because I haven't rung the bell or anything. The gate is wide open. And as is the wont with Lahori still." So, so she said, "What do you see?" So I said, "I see a double-storied house. It's an old house. I see that it's done in lime, and it's kind of got some kind of signs of decay." And she said, and I said, "And I see a wrought iron spiral staircase leading to the top." So she said, "Ah." She said, "Walk around the left of the house." I did that. She said, "Do you see a semicircular veranda?" I said, "I do." She said, "Is the floor black and white marble?" I said, "It is." She said, "Walk up the steps." I did. I went to the main door. I pressed the bell. Somebody came and opened the door. This is all on camera. The gentleman, I think it was, yes, said कि जी मैं आपकी क्या खिदमत कर सकता हूँ. And I said, मेरे साथ फोन पे रोमिला थापड़ जी हैं और मुझे लगता है कि ये उनका बचपन का घर है. So he said, "खुशामदीद, आप अंदर आइए." He opened the door for me without much ado. I walked in.
I said, Romila ji, I think I'm in the entrance hallway. She said, is it wood paneled? I said, yes, it is. She said, is there a staircase? I said, yes, there is. She said, walk up the staircase. I walked up the staircase. She said, is there a door on the right? I said, there is. She said, open the door. I opened the door. Mercifully, it was empty. I walked into the room. She said, what do you see? I'm sorry to be emotional. I said, I see this room and I see a window overlooking a beautiful garden. And she was weeping on the other side and she said, this is my room. This is the room in which I grew up. And Namit,
Mm.
I walked out of that
Mm.
house and I've been in touch with her ever since. But I am just, ever since then and before that, I have been struck by the tragedy of the partition and what it entailed
Yeah.
for so many millions of people and how it came about and the violence with which it took place and the kind of cavalier way in which our colonial imperial masters dealt with it, the way they rushed it, the way, Dickie Mountbatten couldn't be bothered to, do it properly a year later and all of that. And so I thought to myself that, whenever I can, I will tell these stories. But we now have to come back to that story of your collaboration with her and speaking of history. In that, it seems to me that the cornerstone of what the two of you were trying to say, which is very, very meaningful to a layperson like me, is that the historical method is so very essential before you arrive at any theories. But what do you mean by the historical method, Namit?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about the story, the beautiful story you just said. She has a memoir out now,
I
just
know.
being where she describes a lot of this detail. So anyway, let me get back to your question. Um, the just as modern science relies on the scientific method, modern history relies on the historical method. And historians use this method to assess the authenticity and reliability of sources that they're working with. It helps them establish facts first and then interpret them in their rightful context. And this method is what gives historical narratives their greater credibility and authority compared to, say, folk tales or mythology. Now, so let's say we have a question about some episode of the past. Let's say some battle or some kind of a migration that happened. Now, if we follow the historical method, we would begin by gathering all the information that's relevant to our question. And this information can now come from multiple disciplines, linguistics, archaeology, genetics now, um, anthropology, and so on. And the historian must then ask what the nature of each source of information is, because you can't really take any source at face value. The
Correct.
historian has to work like a detective. If it's a document or an artifact, who created and commissioned it back then?
Can I
What
just
was the
interrupt
author's
here?
vantage point?
Can I just
Yeah.
interrupt here and tell you that I found it so amusing and so pertinent when the two of you were talking about Romila ji's first interactions with her students. And when the students say to her,
Hmm.
what should we read, Professor? And she said, go and read Agatha Christie. And then they
Exactly.
say,
Yes.
but why? Why should we read Agatha Christie? And she said, you have to be detectives. What you just said about being a
Yeah.
detective. Gee, carry on.
Yeah. So then, you look at what is the author's vantage point, the author's motivation, the reliability of the voice, the social location of the author, and so on. Is the source contradicted by some other source? And so such questions have a bearing on how any given source is read. And this kind of source analysis, as historians call it, is foundational to the historical method. And out of this foundation emerges a historian's interpretations, which then ought to be presented transparently and argued plainly. And that's history. Now, I would still say that history is not an objective discipline in any sense. And as with all social sciences, historical interpretations have an element, have a subjectivity that's inescapable, but they are not free flowing stories either. They are constrained by the evidence and by the dictates of common reason. The cool thing is that anyone can follow the historical method to challenge any historical interpretation. That's how the discipline works, and this openness is part of its strength, in my view.
Absolutely wonderful, and it is what you say, the wages of being a rigorous historian. And your refusal, Romila ji's famous refusal to pander to falsifications, particularly Hindutva and all of those related tropes. And for that, she suffered harassment and persecution. And I know that you have had your share too, Namit. I want to ask you what the nature of this harassment has been and how have you coped?
Well, Professor Thapar is a brilliant historian, but she's also a master at brushing off all the abuse and harassment that comes her way. And, I've learned from her a little bit. But I would say in general, I think women and Muslim historians in India get far more abuse. And with women, it's often, sexualized abuse. By comparison, what I've faced has been minor. Worse was probably a call for my arrest when the web series had started airing somewhere midway. I generally laugh it off and just simply hope that my mother never sees any of it, because it would only deepen her anxieties, and that would make my life difficult.
She would obviously then regale you with, why did you leave such a brilliant career
Exactly.
in Silicon Valley, beta?
That also happens, yes.
I can hear that. I can hear that. But what particularly about Indians did you do to kind of rile them up?
Well, I think it was just certain interpretations in one of the episodes about the Ramayana, where I was talking about it as just plain mythology, that there is no historical evidence of that Rama ever existed. And this bothered some people, and it is where we are.
Well, you have said that it's the commitment to the method and to treating history as a discipline that distinguishes historians from gossip mongers, let's say. But even in the West, where they pride themselves on being the inventors of the method,
Yeah.
I found that history has often been in the service of empire. Amongst them, for obviously it's they who laid the foundations for an empirical research on history in our colonial times. Who do you regard as the authentic, rigorous historians amongst the ones that you've read?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. History has long been a handmaiden to empire and of various ideological projects, including nationalism. Historical interpretations were deployed to justify British imperial rule in the Indian subcontinent with all kinds of theories. Well, the two-nation theory, whatever else.
Yeah.
And there is, we have the example of Edward Said's Orientalism, where it's one of the texts that exposed the biases and limitations of colonial era scholarship on the East. Now, it's true that the rise of the historical method roughly in the mid 20th century has made the discipline more rigorous. But no less important, in my opinion, has been the greater diversity among historians themselves. Not only in terms of caste, class, race, gender, region, religion, and so on, but also in terms of viewpoint diversity. And this has raised new questions about the past, and it has helped recover many marginalized histories of some people, and challenged also many long-held assumptions and narratives. But even after all that, history, as earlier I alluded to, still remains a human and social science, and its narratives cannot be entirely divorced from its narrators and their social and moral contexts. And so I would say that one way to compensate for the blind spots or biases of individual historians is to read widely across a diverse range of scholars. There is still no good substitute for carefully evaluating competing interpretations and making up your own minds. Um, as for like naming some historians, I hesitate to name just a few because
You and
I'll miss
Romila, you've
out
spoken
the
about
names. But
Hobsbawm. You've spoken about Hobsbawm. You've spoken about other empiricist historians, materialist historians
yes,
in your book.
actually, we have created a list of about 100 scholars and their books in the bibliography of Speaking of History. I would say that's a good starting point.
Good starting
Hobsbawm
point.
is in there. Yeah.
For a lay person, that's a good starting point, because when I'm reading, I'm always thinking, is this the truth? Because
Yeah.
I don't have the time or the inclination or the ability to go to the sources or anything like that. वो तो आपका काम है.
Yeah,
So
it is a challenging problem, and you still have to take time to see the approach of a historian, the rigor of their methods, the references they've used, and of course, it always helps to read multiple histories.
yeah, sure.
Not everybody has that kind of time, though.
Sure.
That's
Have you
true.
found, though, anywhere in your reading a willingness to revise conclusions as better evidence emerges?
Well, it does sometimes seem like people are not willing to revise their conclusions despite the evidence. But I think there is a difference between the popular sphere and the academic sphere. In the popular realm, people are often heavily invested in religious stories and identities, so they're less willing to revise their conclusions. But in academia, revising conclusions in light of new evidence or better questions does happen. It's true that an individual scholar may not revise his or her opinions, but that's fine as long as some other scholars in the academy do so and they shift the balance. And think of the revisions that have come into mainstream Indian history after feminists and Dalits entered the academy. Or similarly, the entry of scholars from the non-Western world in Western universities.
Correct.
It has asked questions about the Eurocentric assumptions that governed earlier narratives, and they've helped recover marginalized voices and experiences.
Absolutely. Edward Said being
So it
a
does
case in
happen.
point. Edward Said being a case in point, as you've just said. But
Absolutely.
Namit, what do you consider to have been the biggest distortions in subcontinental public history? And when I say subcontinental, I include Pakistan. And what do you consider to have been their most harmful consequences?
Well, so I'll give you 3-4 examples of the distortions in the Indian public sphere. So an important one that keeps coming up is regarding the origin of the Indo-Aryans.
Yeah.
Okay, because this is very important here because it has implications for origins of things like Sanskrit and the early Vedas and Vedic gods and fire rituals. Lots of these things that seen as origins of or the roots of Hinduism. And so in popular history, Indo-Aryans are seen as indigenous to the subcontinent because people want to believe that all of these things are primordially native to the subcontinent. So that's one. A second one I would say is, as a view of understanding of the early society and culture of India. And, there is this belief in the public sphere that there was a Hindu golden age of peace and prosperity in ancient India, where life centered on the Vedas and all these wise rishis and munis, and They imagine the Vedas as the fountainhead of Indian culture. And the Harappans are either ignored, or if they are included now, sometimes they're seen as they were actually Indo-Aryans. So they.
Oh, and the Harappans were Indo-Aryans too. My goodness.
So
Yeah.
that is one of the narratives in the public sphere, and and part of all this golden age narrative is that these Vedas are also a source of advanced scientific insights, and which they claim have been verified by NASA and so on. I mean, laughable stuff, but this still is
I
very
mean,
much
you're telling me, Namit,
there.
you're telling me we are old hands at falsifying history. We began long before you guys. We began to revise our textbooks in the 70s. We built up this huge kind of justification and falsified huge swathes of Pakistan's history. Everything began with Muhammad bin Qasim's raid in 7/11.
Yes.
And there was a huge big gap in between. Muhammad bin Qasim was a great proselytizer. I mean, he was a raider. He came for various specific objects, etc. Many people in his army had, were locals who were mercenaries, etc. And religion wasn't a thing at that time in that sense. Then, there's a big gap. And then there's the Mughals temporarily. And then our textbooks have become victims of all this false propaganda. But the pity is that people like us, the kind of liberal peaceniks, etc., who were thought of themselves as irrationals, that we used to look at India and Indian scholarship with hope. And we used to think, कि चलो वहां तो कुछ ठीक हो रहा है. But आप भी हम जैसे निकले. You have not learned from our mistakes, you're repeating them. We have suffered the Zia decade with disastrous consequences, and you're doing the same to yourselves. Why?
Yeah. Why are we following Pakistan? In many ways. Well, I think a lot of it has to do, this sort of falsification of history is very closely linked to the rise of religious nationalism in recent decades, I think. Pakistan took that path a few decades before us, and we are heading that way too. So and in general, I would say that nationalism seeks legitimacy from the past everywhere. And in the Indian case, the ideology of Hindutva requires a particular historical narrative to legitimize their political vision in the present. And so, it requires, for example, the roots of Hindu religion to be entirely native, and and so on, to contrast it with the outsider roots of Islam and Christianity. So they can claim that this is truly a Hindu nation. So these are the sorts of motivations which animate this crowd. And yeah, the evidence is not really important. From all the evidence of linguistics, from archaeology, from genetic evidence today is simply ignored.
No,
Um,
it's high
they,
blasphemy, or it's blasphemy. In our case, it's blasphemy.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think that we should talk about what actually has brought us to this pass in the modern era, Namit, and was this distorted image of reality conjured up? I think it's the bedrock of it lies in the colonial historical work of someone like James Mill, who basically was the inventor of the two-nation theory, which ironically has become a great tool in the hands, no less of Pakistan's Islamic ideologues, as it has amongst India's Hindutva proponents. So, what an irony! What an irony!
yeah. Yeah, I think that, yeah, of course, that's the where things in some ways begin. The two-nation theory comes from James Mill, who wrote his history without ever visiting the subcontinent, by the way. And he saw India's past in terms of these two homogeneous communities, which he called nations, Hindu and Muslim, which he imagined were locked in perpetual hostility. All of this was made up. But it later became an influential framing for the rise of both Hindu and Muslim nationalisms. But so that's one. But I think there are At least a couple other factors that that come to mind here. I think the first is even this modern idea of representational politics, which was introduced top down in the colonial period. And for the first time, it created competition for political power through votes. And in a society with a highly undemocratic and hierarchical social order, uh, and we introduced this sort of competition. Under these conditions, it was perhaps inevitable that political actors would appeal to the social identities that people lean on to distinguish themselves from others. And what happens in a deeply religious and caste-based society like ours? Religion and caste naturally become the basis for identity politics. And we didn't quite have enough of a democratic ethos grounded in secular citizenship and civic nationalism. Pakistan barely even tried. They began life as an Islamic republic. India started out much better,
No,
but even there,
sorry to interrupt. We were the Republic of Pakistan until much later in the 50s when we became the Islamic, well, not even that. We became in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan a couple of decades later. Usse pehle we were the Republic of Pakistan.
okay, thanks for that correction. Yes, actually, that you're right. And then India, for India, it took a bit longer, and the combination of electoral democracy and the identities of religion and caste, even here, created fertile ground for the emergence of Hindutva nationalism. I suppose this is always the risk inherent in the practice of democracy in countries like India and Pakistan. Another factor I would say is one that India shares with many other societies where we see nationalism surging today. And that's neoliberal economic policies which have widened inequalities and intensified economic anxieties among people. And at the same time, the rapid social transformations of the last 3 or 4 decades have left many people feeling insecure, disoriented, and vulnerable to populist appeals and demagogic leaders. And such conditions provide fertile ground for culture wars, which often serve the interests of the elites by diverting attention away from economic inequalities and discouraging solidarities based on social class. Instead, rather than mobilizing against concentration of wealth and power, people are encouraged to see one another mainly through cultural, religious, or ethnic categories. And it's really another form of divide and rule. And it's happening in many societies today.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely. And to digress for a second, I did want to ask you about something lest I forget, which is very, very important. You've spoken about this in your book. You rightly say that all the new components that are coming into the method of history are just truly fascinating stuff, what's coming up now. Apart from linguistics, sociology, archaeology, which have been bedrocks for quite some time. But now you have genetic science at your service. You have carbon dating, you have archaeomagnetic dating. Do you find in India an acceptance of these new tools? Because in Pakistan, I do see a glimmer of hope and acceptance of these new tools in some places, Namit. Anything at your end?
Well, I think the reality is that large numbers of people will deny any new form of evidence if it conflicts with their deep-seated beliefs.
Yeah.
So that's how it's going to be for the foreseeable future. That said, and to your point, I also see a bigger audience for evidence-based history. Many public historians of quality have acquired significant audiences in India, reflecting a greater interest in the past. And that's a positive thing, I suppose.
Absolutely. And long may it last and long may it grow. But in speaking of history, you discuss how the tyranny of Muslim rulers, beginning with Mahmud's invasion in 1000 CE, And the victimization of Hindus doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. And the real picture is more complex, you say. For instance, I found it fascinating when you revealed that one of Mahmud's most fearsome regiments was commanded by a Hindu named Tilak.
Yeah. On this question of victimization of Hindus, when you look at Indian history in some detail, you will find examples of atrocities by rulers and armies of many backgrounds. And it's clear that much of it was driven by things like political calculus, raids for wealth, territorial growth, revenue extraction, or in many cases, simple dynastic rivalries. So, it is at the same time, it is also possible to identify instances of religiously motivated persecution, whether of Hindus by Muslim rulers or of Buddhists by Hindu rulers. However, I've found little evidence to suggest that Hindus as a group were subjected to systematic or recurring persecution simply for being Hindus, especially Brahmanical Hindus.
It's very interesting that you talk about the persecution of other religious communities, and you say that you didn't find evidence in your readings of a systematic kind of persecution. I can tell you that since the creation of Pakistan, there have been moments in Pakistan when there has been systematic persecution of minorities, and it has led to disastrous consequences for the nation. And not just the minorities, but other provinces as well. We've had the country split into two because of a non-acceptance of rights and others and coexistence. And it's such a pity that although I think in Pakistan we seem to have recognized how harmful it's been, we're right here in your neighborhood, and yet people are not learning from our mistakes. I mean, do we have to repeat history as farce over and over again? Are we condemned to that?
Yeah, people don't listen, but they have to commit the same mistakes themselves, suffer the consequences. Sometimes they don't even learn even then. So I don't know what the rule here is.
I know, but coming back to your recounting of history, Namit, I found the discussion between you and Dr. Thapar regarding the desecration or the so-called desecration of the Somanatha Mandir particularly interesting. That this took place, as you know, in 1026 CE. And the two of you have spoken about this at length and discussed it. I would like our viewers to know some of your views about this, please.
Well, yeah, it's a long story, and I can't do justice to it here. But briefly, what's interesting to me about Mahmud's attack and plunder of Somnath's wealth, which nobody denies, by the way, is how it appears in the historical records.
And I'd just like to say
In
here,
fact,
it has assumed legendary proportions both in India and in Pakistan. And
that's true. Yeah.
it causes a lot of difficulty in both countries.
Yeah. Yeah. So this raid is what's notable. It's only mentioned in Turco-Persian chronicles, which in different ones, and they don't agree on what happened at Somnath, the details of it. Curiously, there is no record of the raid in any Hindu or Jain chronicle at the time.
Fascinating.
There is total silence. And, so 12 years, we have one description, 12 years after the raid, a Goan king visits the temple on a pilgrimage and comes there, does not mention Mahmud's raid, nor any damage to the temple. Now, there's different ways of looking at this, and some scholars have suggested that perhaps the damage to the temple and the plunder of its wealth was not as traumatic an event as it is presumed by more recent people today. That perhaps it was the same sort of setback as with earlier temple raids by rival Hindu kings. So this was a subcontinental practice that happened earlier.
Yeah,
The
this was the thing,
locals,
wasn't it?
yes, it seems the local just rebuilt and moved on. And in any case, what we see is that local chronicles from a century or so later describe the grant of a land near the temple, in the temple precincts, to Muslim traders to build a mosque. These two things are coming up near each other. And trade with Turco-Persians flourishes. The raid was utterly forgotten in that region until British scholars discovered it in 1835 and spoke about it in the parliament. They found it in dusty Turco-Persian archives. It was only then that Hindu revivalists seized on this narrative and gave it new life. And that suited the British just fine. And until then, Hindus appear to have carried no memory of these temple raids, at least nothing resembling the accounts in Turco-Persian chronicles, nor any sense of any collective trauma or humiliation or 1,000 years of suffering and so on. That's later on people made up stories about it. In fact, this episode can be seen as a textbook example of how memories and emotions can be manufactured and weaponized for political ends. Professor Thapar has actually written the definitive book on Somnath, analyzing all of this detail. There are many, many, many other facets of it. And she's done really an extraordinary, that work is really brilliant. I would recommend that to your viewers.
I will seek it out, definitely. You ask another important question related to this discussion. How can we reduce wars to Hindu-Muslim conflicts, Muslim-Hindu conflicts, when some of the attackers were Muslim, their generals were Hindu, their foot soldiers were both Hindu and Muslims. Some of them were just foot soldiers in their recruits in their army. Some of them were mercenaries. Some Hindu mercenaries would fight on the side of Muslim conquerors who were attacking Hindu Rajas. Yeah. Hindu Rajas would have Muslim generals, Muslim mercenaries working on their side. What was all that about, Namit?
Well, I think it's really important to go beneath the headline news and pay attention to the details. So, we take the battle, examples help. So take the battle at Haldigati, 1576, which is often seen as, by many groups in India, as being in essence a great Hindu-Muslim conflict, in which the brave Rajputs on one side fought to defend Hindu India against the Mughals. You go beneath and look at the details. At the composition of the armies, for example, what does that reveal about the nature of this conflict? On closer examination, one finds that Akbar's Mughal army is led by two Rajput generals and their Rajput contingents. Rana Pratap's army, on the other side, has a contingent led by descendants of the Suri rulers,
exactly,
who were Muslims. Their general, Hakim Khan Suri,
in that battle, Hakim Khan.
Hakim Khan Suri lost his life for Maharana Pratap. And so how can we treat this as just a Hindu-Muslim battle? It is a complex political conflict in which all kinds of entities are involved on each side with their own distinct motivations. And so to understand what this battle is, we have to look at various political relationships that were also governing this conflict. I think it's just foolish to reduce this to a Hindu-Muslim conflict. And this is the reality of most battles in medieval India.
और आप देखें that on the Mughal side, there would have been some princes astride horses or astride elephants, if not participating in the battle, then certainly looking at it from a vantage point, or even being generals, etc., who had Rajput mothers as blood running in their veins. They grew up
absolutely
with tilak on their forehead. They were, brought up by their mothers. The lullabies that were sung to them were all indigenous language used by the women of the household, many of them were Rajput princesses.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And one other related tangential thing, but how does the cruelty, quote unquote, of pre-modern Muslim conquerors and rulers compare with again, quote unquote, the cruelty of Hindu kings in ancient or medieval India, like the Cholas, the Vijayanagar Rajas, and the Marathas later. How does that compare? Of pre-modern kings?
When it comes to military violence and cruelty, I do not believe that pre-modern Muslim rulers were on average worse than Hindu kings. The three examples you gave, let's look through each of them. So we have for the Cholas, in the Mahavamsa, it has gory details of Chola atrocities in Sri Lanka in the 10th, 11th centuries. The Cholas also led brutal invasions of many coastal regions, leading up to the Ganga plains. Then you come to the Vijayanagar rulers, who were between 14th and 16th centuries. They engaged in vicious warfare against both Hindu and Muslim polities, which are graphically described by chroniclers like Firishta. And then, Vijayanagar was very much, historians characterize that as an imperial war state, which was sustained by military force. The Marathas, especially under the Peshwas, were no better. In the so-called Borgi invasions of the 1740s, Maratha troops plundered and brutalized civilians in Bengal on annual raids spanning a decade, for a whole decade.
Hindus and Muslims.
In other words,
yeah.
Yes. In other words, military brutality, sometimes also against civilians, was practiced by all groups. It was very much a feature of pre-modern state formation and military expansion. And, as the saying goes, is hammam mein sab nange hain.
बिल्कुल 100%। आपने ही ये मुहावरा इसमें इंट्रोड्यूस किया। मुझे तो आपने सख्ती से मना किया हुआ था कि किंग्स इंग्लिश के अलावा हमने कोई बात नहीं करनी, बट अब आप इस तरफ आ ही गए हैं, तो आई वुड लाइक यू टू टेल मी अ लिटिल बिट अबाउट द बैटल ऑफ तालिकोटा, बिकॉज यू स्पीक अबाउट दिस with authority in your book, and again, it's a very fascinating episode. Please tell us.
Well, there are many things to talk about Talikota building up to it, but I'll maybe just talk about the specifics of the battle again. At its peak, the Vijayanagar Empire covered much of South India, and it arose in the 14th century and lasted until this battle, which it lost against an opportunistic alliance of 4 of the 5 sultanates, Deccan sultanates, to its north. By then, this region had already had a long history of Muslims fighting each other, Hindus fighting each other, Hindus allying with Muslims to fight Hindus, Muslims allying with Hindus to fight Muslims. You have all permutations and combinations, right? So, and today, of course, many Hindu nationalists fondly imagine Vijayanagar as this proud Hindu kingdom that bravely resisted the onslaught of Islam. But scholars have long abandoned this view. As in the case with Haldighati, the armies of the sultanates had Hindu soldiers and generals, just as Vijayanagar's armies had Muslims and Christian soldiers and generals. After Vijayanagar's defeat, the capital city was plundered by the victorious troops of the sultanates. This was a custom of the time, part of the benefits of war for the victorious soldiers. And so this plundering was done by Hindus like the Marathas of Bijapur and Telugus of Golconda. They were also included. So it's a complex story that does not support the modern Hindutva narratives about it.
Similarly, in Pakistan, Namit, people are now just beginning to discuss Ranjit Singh, the composition of Ranjit Singh's army, for instance. I mean, when he went to battle against Nawab Muzaffar Khan of Multan, Nawab Muzaffar Khan Sadozai of Multan, his foot soldiers, many of them were Muslim. Many of his generals were Muslim, and they fought and defeated the Nawab. And similarly, when Hari Singh Nalwa, Ranjit Singh's most famous general, went and conquered what we then later subsequently knew as the Northwest Frontier, now known as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and they gave battle to the Pathan tribes, to Afghans. उस formation में भी there were many Muslims who fought on the side of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Ranjit Singh had an array of Muslim ministers, some of whom were most influential, more influential even than sometimes Raja Dhyan Singh, who was his right-hand man. The Fakir brothers of Fakir Khana, Azizuddin, Nuruddin, they were sometimes, more important to him. So this in pre-modern times, it's about power, it's about booty, it's about conquest. It's all these things. And
Yeah.
if you don't mind my saying so, Namit, we're witnessing the US-Iran war, we're witnessing what's happening in Gaza, we're witnessing what's happening in Lebanon and the West Bank. What has changed? मुझे तो कोई फर्क नहीं नजर आ रहा इस हमाम में यकीनन as you just said सब नंगे हैं
Yes.
pre-modern times modern
Yeah.
times it's just the terminology has changed the weapons have changed and I think the language of power has changed your
Yeah.
take
Yeah, absolutely right. No, the devil lies in the details. I think I think it's, if you probe beneath, you see like there's so much similarity across so many of these conflicts.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you've spoken about pre-colonial India in your book and your web series. And what emerges is a very rich amalgam of religions, cultures, it having been a melting pot for millennia. But some of the habits that we've gleaned off each other, the peoples who've lived together for millennia, have stuck. I see it every day in our lives, whether it's here or across the border or wherever. I'm sure you do too. And no matter what the divisions are between ourselves, for instance, living in the part of the world that I do, I live partly in Lahore and I live partly in the rural areas of Okada. I'm struck by the persistence of caste in our societies, Namit, amongst Muslims and Christians alike. Caste
Yeah.
is a thing and it still persists. I mean, I know it from personal experience. I broke caste all of 40 years ago when I decided to marry somebody who was not a Sayyid, who was not Shia, etc. But it was horrific at that time. It took a lot of doing and it continues to persist. So,
Yeah.
what is this about caste that is so persistent and stubborn?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I mean, look at like the origins of caste and so on. The early spread of caste is really intimately tied with the spread of Brahmanism. So it was
Exactly.
an elite ideology that started flowing down from the late first millennium BCE or thereabouts. Brahmanism was this cultural package that included the religion itself with its gods and rituals and so on, but also ideas of caste and endogamy and patriarchy, which started eroding the older matrilineal sensibilities of the subcontinent. And
I
later,
would
when
love to discuss
and of
that
course
with
this
you,
kept.
Namit, one day. Sorry to interrupt. You must give me the time again to please speak to you about that old time, the predating era of the Aryan invasions. You spoke about it in Indians and your first episode, which is about the Harappan civilization, Mohenjo-daro, etc. By the way, I hope you recognize the ajrak that I'm wearing. And I've done especially because this is our episode. This is our program about history. And Ajrak, as you know, was invented in Mohenjo-daro. And the priest king of Mohenjo-daro is wearing an Ajrak. Oh, it may be a fanciful idea of mine.
Fascinating. Yeah.
But this is
Ah,
Ajrak, which is basically dyed with madder and indigo. And so this is a symbol of the Indus Valley. But to go back to that, to the Indus Valley, and you've spoken of patriarchy in your book. It seems to have been a hallmark of the Yamnaya culture, which the Aryans brought with them when they came from the southern Pontic steppe of South Russia, Kazakhstan, into India. But where I live, I see daily subversions of patriarchy. I see rife patriarchy as well, rampant all over the place. But I also
yeah.
see subversions. I also see subversions. And it may be hopelessly romantic of me, but I think it's our old cultures also persist along with the layer upon layer upon layer of other cultures that have been added on more recently. What do you think of that?
Well, the old cultures very rarely entirely disappear. But here's what I would say. So the Yamanaya and the Indo-European lineages were famously patriarchal, and there's lots of different parameters by which um, the people have studied this. They encountered subcontinental cultures that appear to have been relatively gender egalitarian, and after that, basically the subcontinent then had a host of around that time matrilineal cultures. The Harappan visual culture shows so many women and in great numbers, some of them no doubt mother goddesses. So Indo-Aryan culture, including their patriarchy, spread top-down in subsequent centuries, and things changed. Matrilineal has all but disappeared in the subcontinent. The subversions you're speaking of, I may have some remnant of that. I don't really know. I can't comment on it. My hunch is that it also has something to do with with another source, such as the power that income generating labor grants women in certain social classes. That you find those more in rural India, compared to say housewives in urban, upper classes. So you see that at the lower social strata, you women tend to have, because they are bringing in money into the household, they have more power. Maybe there's something of that in here too.
Yeah, and then also I see a kind of, again, quote unquote, a kind of looseness of morals, which is, I mean, I don't consider it a looseness of morals, if you like, but
Hmm.
the kind of thing that urban people are very judgmental about. Those kind of standards don't really, they're there in rural societies, obviously, because you have a lot of urban influence now. But you also see that kind of libertarianism that doesn't exist in urban societies. And that may or may not have to do with how productive agrarian women are. It just seems to persist. I see these things, I see these
Yeah.
threads, and I like to tie them together. And I like to think, well, we live in the Harappan area and in the Indus Valley, and it has a kind of different culture. I also just want to say
Yeah.
to you that modern genetics, and especially the work of David Reich, the geneticist from Harvard, has
Yes.
shown that all of us in the North, have a very, very strong evidence of Yamanayak culture,
Yes.
patriarchal, kind of fathers from that culture, the Y
Yeah.
chromosome. And the mitochondrial DNA is all from Indus Valley women. When I think of that, Namit, I cannot help but assume that it must have been a very, very violent takeover.
There are some scholars who believe that. Um, Although it's not considered a standard statist type invasion in that sense. So people don't talk about the Aryan invasion theory. The model today is to speak of it in terms of waves of migrants coming in.
Yeah.
But they brought a very different and a very distinct culture. These are pastoralists. Here you have agriculturalists, and they have very different set of beliefs and so on. It's male heavy migration. And it's not like some friction would definitely have happened. They would have needed, women for mates. And it's not like people here are just ready to turn over here, or women would just say, I'm going to come with you. There would have been violence. Challenge with this is it's a very compelling hypothesis, but I think someone like Professor Thapar would caution that we don't have very hard evidence yet. So it's at the stage of a hypothesis, which makes sense, but we need to more evidence to really turn it into a
Yeah, we
proper
need to
theory.
apply the historical method to it, in your words.
Exactly. Yeah.
Correct. You've suggested that at the root of a lot of religious nationalism, there lies a deep inferiority complex. What do you mean by that?
Hmm. Well, I mean, especially in the Hindutva nationalism, this is not a new idea. It has been explored by scholars like Partha Chatterjee, Ashish Nandi, Christoph Jafferlo. So, I mean, and you can look at it both in terms of what are the symptoms of this complex, and then maybe look at some causes behind it. So in terms of symptoms, we've all seen these exaggerated claims about ancient scientific or cultural achievements, a heightened and selective sense of victimhood. There's the persistent inability to look critically at our own culture with its history of caste and patriarchy. Hindutva people just are unwilling to do that. And they have this search for external validation, at the same time, invoking Western figures like Einstein, Voltaire, or Wildorand to affirm the greatness of Hindu civilization. That's not the stance of a self-confident people. Now, what are the causes behind this? And some of these scholars locate this in India's encounter with the West during the colonial period. Europe represented not just political power, but also new systems of knowledge, modern science and scholarship that seem to offer more powerful explanations of the natural and the social world. At the same time, many colonial era scholars denigrated Hindu traditions as inferior and superstitious. And so the sections of Hindu elites internalized these judgments and the colonial yardsticks, and in response developed this defensive posture rooted in a sense of inferiority. So, and that has become really the roots of Hindutva. You see it, flourishing there today.
Well, I'm fascinated by this because obviously I see many similarities and parallel happenings on our side of the border with this. But we've had a very, I think, wide-ranging conversation, and I'm very grateful for your time, Namit, and I hope to take you up on, my demand and your I hope, acquiescence in discussing the Indus Valley civilization at some stage as well.
Let's do it sometime. Yeah.
We must. But last but not least, I do want to ask you, Namit, where does hope lie? Where does hope lie? Does it lie? Is there hope that we will understand ourselves and each other better?
Well, I find it hard to be hopeful about the world today. The two countries that I'm closest to, where I've spent the most time, the United States and India, are both in deep trouble. Their politics have taken a fascist turn in recent years. India's far-right regime, as you know, is pursuing its project of Hindu Rashtra, modeled after Israel, in which its Muslim minority is being turned into second-class citizens. And nearly all of our civic and democratic institutions like the media, the Election Commission, the judiciary, higher education, they've been captured in the service of this self-destructive project. And all this is happening with significant support from the Hindu middle classes who have been radicalized. I see it among my relatives. So it's very disconcerting. We've also, on the international front, we've also just seen this horrendous genocide unfold with the active support of the oldest democracy and other European powers, which has permanently exposed the hollowness of the global world order led by the West. We had some illusions about it earlier. It's very hard to go back to that now. Then we have climate change bearing down at us fast, and the Indian subcontinent is expected to suffer greatly from its ravages, one of the worst hit areas likely to be. We have economic inequalities continuing to escalate. You have the disruptions of AI that people are talking about ahead. So hope is not easy to find in today's world, but I am encouraged by the greater discussion and debate happening today about these issues. There is resistance and pushback from many quarters, and I'm hopeful that this will amount to something. It will make a difference. I know that's not a very
No, on that
robust,
note,
it is really a feeble statement of hope, but that's where I am today.
On that note, and you as a historian and me as a lay reader, we know that the world has been through many traumatic times and it has emerged. Mother Nature has healed and Homo sapiens have emerged again and again and again. And I do hope that the young, especially, will be a source of new thinking in this world to come. Thank you so much, Namit Arora.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
Let's talk
Thank you
again.
so much for having me.
Thank you
Yes.
so much. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Bye.